Hi everyone and welcome to the episode number 2 of the GattoCast, the Nanowar related and unrelated stuff podcast with Gatto Pancheri 666, which is me. I'm your host, founder and bass player of Nanowar Of Steel. So today we're gonna talk about one of the songs that were featured on our latest full-length album. The album is called Stairway to Valhalla, and the song is called Tooth Fairy. Now, let me have a few introductory words on this song. First of all, I'm pretty proud of this song because the lyrics actually make sense in a way. What I mean is that they are not just a random parody, they are not just some random bullshit like maybe Barbie Milf Princess of the Twilight, but if you actually read and understand the text, you would notice that there's not just an ensemble of acronyms and funny words, but it tells a story that makes sense from an economic point of view. Now, let me have a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I'm not an economist. So I like economics, I read a lot about economics and finance, but by training I am, as you might know, an astrophysicist. So all my knowledge in the economics field comes purely from my interest. So I'm a self-taught, whatever I learned, I self-taught it. Basically. I'm an independent learner, so to say. And second disclaimer, now as you will notice if you know economics, but if you don't, now let me tell it to you. The lyrics of these songs are inspired by the business cycle theory of Mises and Hayek, who are two Austrian economists of the they were pretty famous in the beginning of the last century, so beginning of the 20th century. And what I'm doing in this song, I'm not endorsing or criticizing the theory. I'm just making a song out of it because it sounds funny. That's the bottom line. So please do not draw any political conclusion on Nanowar's standpoint on economics or on social issues. That's absolutely not what we want to do, even though here the subject matter is pretty politically and economically charged, I would say, like from these two standpoints. But we just want to make people laugh, and the bottom line of this song is that, though, as I said, it makes sense in the sense that words are not just random jokes, but they do tell something deeper about. They convey some deeper messages about economic theories. Despite this, we do not want to endorse any political or economical position. That's not what we want to do. We just want to have people laugh at what we say. Now, let me introduce you to this song. It was written around 2015, 2016. So some of the facts and people mentioned in the song, in the lyrics, that was then released 2 years after. So some of the facts and people that are referred to, you will notice there are maybe a couple of outdated facts and numbers that are quoted there. Simply because the song was published 2 to 3 years after it was actually been written. So, how did we come with the idea of the song and the lyrics? Well, first of all, as you might have noticed, the music is pretty much inspired by Stradivarius, but this is something that came after. So, the first idea was to write a song pretty much in the vein of what we did with Barbagianni, so with Il Cacciatore della Notte, which is a song that we wrote in Italian, and it's pretty technical in its details about this bird. So it's a kind of ode that we are writing about, and there's basically no jokes in that song. If you really read the lyrics, it's a very serious song in that way. And so we wanted to do something along those lines here, in the sense that we wanted to have some discrepancy we wanted to create this effect of discrepancy between a very serious text and a very heavy metal song, so in the vein of Stratovarius. Now, the thing that will work, at least that we were thinking of, is that Stratovarius, they have all these sort of mystical themes, like they talk about Nostradamus a lot, and they have all this. This is, I mean, it's not just Stratovarius, but they are one of the ones that can come to my mind. So, and it would be funny to think about this band singing about finance and monetary policy and economics with very deep conviction, just like we do in this song. So this was more or less the basic idea. Now, let me start with the song. So we'll go through the lyrics, and so let's go. This is how the song starts. We'll listen to the first chunk up to the first strophe. So here we go.
There is another message that I want to tell you today, is that within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough.
Alright, so what you heard was basically the introduction of the song, and there's in the first strophe there's two lines that go like this and say, floating in the night on your butterfly wings, sneaking in the room while the infant is asleep. Eye for an eye, coin for a tooth, tooth fairy, do you know the financial impact of your deeds? Alright, so the first two lines are just an introduction to what the tooth fairy is supposed to do, so entering a room while the infant sleeps. And so there's nothing deep about these first two lines. And then there's the turning point of the song, which comes pretty early on, and it's eye for an eye, coin for a tooth, tooth fairy, do you know the financial impact of your deeds? So here is the basic mechanism by which we claim that tooth fairy is generating inflation now. I mean, by which the tooth fairy is having an impact on the economy as a whole. What does the tooth fairy do then? The tooth fairy exchanges a coin for a tooth, so it's giving money in exchange for a tooth, so for a dead tooth. And so the thing is that once you do this, you're supposedly creating money out of thin air. And this is a mechanism that we'll be exploring later on. So it's linked to inflation. And so, tooth fairy, do you know the financial impact of your deeds? So, let us go on with the song and listen to the first bridge of the song. Here we go. So, did anybody tell you that by inflating the money supply, you are distorting the structure of production? Did anybody tell you that PQ equals MV? You are responsible for the rise of the interest rates. Alright, so money supply, what is it? It's basically quantity of money that circulates in an economy. It can be defined in several ways. There are actually 3 to 4 definitions, if I don't remember wrongly. But anyway, bottom line is that the money supply is a term that refers to the quantity of money, for those of you who are not familiar with this definition. Now there's a very specific term that is very widely used by Austrian economics authors, and is the structure of production. Now, what is the structure of production, and how is the tooth fairy distorting the structure of production? First of all, the structure of production is a concept that is related to the fact that producing goods in an economy has different stages. Now you have two different types of goods. You have capital goods that are, for example, machines and factories, are not goods that you would that serve human beings per se. They are goods that are created in order to create other goods. So you don't build a factory because you like the factory. You build a factory because you want to build objects that you like. For example, you want to build a sex toys factory or an ice cream factory because then these goods like sex toys, ice creams are consumer goods. So they are goods that can be directly consumed by the users, so by the people, and so these goods are those that are important from the standpoint of human welfare, so to say. Now, how much money in an economy is allocated in the production of capital goods or consumer goods depends on interest rates, which in turn also depend on the quantity of money. So the thing is that interest rates in a way can be seen as a price of money. So if there is a lot of money in circulation, at first we might think that interest rates drop down because money is plentiful and abundant. And so this is a general term for at least for the beginning of the inflation of the money supply. This is what happens, like when central banks lower the interest rates, then the interest rates go down, and which means that it will be easier to borrow money from a central bank or from a bank in general as a second order effect. And so low interest rates means that there will be more long-term projects, such as the kind of capital goods that I was talking of. And why does this happen? This happens because long-term projects are those that are more sensitive to the variation in interest rates. So, for example, if you have to buy something that costs 100 euros, say, and interest rates are 1%, then after 10 years you would pay 110 euros as total price. But if the interest rates were 5%, after 10 years you will be paying 150. So there's a huge difference, there's 40 euros difference. If for the same good you don't have a time span of 10 years, but you only have 1 year, then the difference is only 4 euros. It's not so much in the end. You might as well go for the higher interest rates. It's not affecting so much the price. It's a 4% of the price difference, whereas in 10 years it's 40% of the price. So I hope you understand what I mean by this. Now, the thing is that this is a structure of production, so you will be allocating more money to projects that have a long-term kind of duration. So it's a long-term project, so like real estate, like building houses, building factories, and this kind of capital goods. So long-term projects will be affected the most. You will be allocating more money to this kind of long-term projects. So this is at first it looks like interest rates go down, and so this is stimulating the economy in a way. So there are more long-term projects being started. There's there's more money and people are spending more. But the thing is that when this mechanism is not backed up by a increase in the productivity, it means that there is too much money circulating. So this is an artificial effect. And so this is generating inflation, in the sense that there is too much money in circulation with respect to the goods that the economy can produce. So this in turn leads to the high interest rates. So this is what we say in the end. You're responsible for the rise of the interest rates. Because at first interest rates go down, then monetary inflation kicks in. It takes some time, so at first everything looks nice and bright, and then after a couple of years, inflation catches up because the economy is not in fact able to sustain this monetary expansion, and so prices need to rise because there is too much money with respect to the abundance of goods in the economy. So again, this is what triggers the high interest rates that we are holding the tooth fairy responsible for. Now there is this PQ equals MV. So first of all, let me say that this is more likely the first time, at least it's the first time I've seen an equation inside a song. So I'm pretty proud of this. If you know of any other song featuring equations, whatever they are, can be from economics, biology, or physics, mathematics, whatever, let me know because I'm not aware of that. So I'll go to Wikipedia here and refer to the equation of exchange. You see PQMV. So P is the price level, Q is the index of expenditures, so how much money is being spent on goods and services in a given economy. V is the so-called velocity of money, so it's the frequency at which money is being spent. And M is the total amount of money supply. So what you see here is that if you keep Q, the expenditure on goods, and P fixed, so if you increase M, the money supply, then you see that price level has to go up. Let me state it again. If you fix two of the terms, as for example, if you the velocity and expenditure index Q, if you increase the money supply, then also P has to go up, which is basically what we are claiming here, that tooth fairy is generating inflation by means of expansion of the money supply. Again, so here we ended up commenting the first bridge and we move on to the chorus. Let's listen to the chorus of Tooth Fairy. Here we go. Alright, so first of all, let me comment on the helicopter drop. Everything else I think is pretty much self-explanatory. We already said that the tooth fairy is creating inflation and by means of an increase of the money supply without increasing the productivity of the economy. So what is a helicopter drop? It's a term that was invented, so to say, by Milton Friedman. And what was he referring to when talking about helicopter drop? Now, the thing is that in general, if you have a central bank pumping money into an economy, you would do it by means of, for example, injecting capitals into private banks or other financial institutions, and money might just as well stay there and might not go into circulation in the economy and might not cause inflation. So there are many examples related to Japan, for example, famously in the 90s and in the years 2000 up to nowadays. They have repeatedly tried to increase inflation rates by expanding the monetary mass, and they didn't succeed. Now, what Milton Friedman said is that if you really want to be successful in driving up prices, so in driving up inflation, avoiding deflation, the most effective way would be to drop money with a helicopter. So you just take packs of money and drop them with a helicopter around cities. So people would just get them and spend it straight away. And this would be the most effective way of generating inflation. Now, he wasn't really advocating for that. He was just stating that this would be an effective mechanism. He wasn't really saying that seriously. I think it was sort of metaphor of clearing things, so making it clear how would someone be really sure of generating inflation with a very straightforward method. So your donations push up aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is the total demand. Aggregate in the sense that it includes the states, institutions, and people's demand for goods and services. So what it's saying here is that the tooth fairy is giving money to people, and people will consume, and more consumption means more demand for goods and services. This is pretty straightforward. Your donations push up aggregate demand thanks to a higher MPC. Now this is another economic terms. So the MPC is the marginal propensity to consume, and it basically means what's the if I give you $100 extra, what's the fraction of this money that you're likely to be consuming. Now if you give this money to a very rich person, maybe he won't consume it, he will just invest it or put it somewhere in a bank account. If you give it to some poor people or with people with low sense of investment, or simply kids because they don't have a feel of retiring for or saving or investing, now this money would most likely be spent straight away. And so once you spend on goods and services, you're increasing the aggregate demand, as I said before. And so individuals with a higher MPC, such as kids, that are the ones that are targeted by the monetary expansion of the tooth fairy, they are those that drive up aggregate demand through a higher MPC, as I explained. So next step is wiping out the wealth of the middle class. Now, wealth is accumulated income. So as you can look at it in terms of savings in the bank account, real estate properties, investments in stocks, and so on. And so the thing is that with high inflation, when inflation kicks in, the monetary value of these assets is dropping, in the sense that if you bought a home for 100,000 euros and then the euro loses most of its value within 1 year, part of the value of the house that you own is being lost. Now, low class does not have much of a accumulated income, does not have much of wealth, so there's nothing to wipe out there. Upper classes, they usually have large chunks of their wealth abroad or in very well protected assets. I mean, like they might have gold or they might have bank accounts abroad, and so they might not be, they're not completely affected by domestic inflation. So domestic inflation mainly targets the wealth of the middle class. Last step, stop it in the name of the central bank. Now, central banks are the institutions that regulate the quantity of money in an economy. Most of the times, not Italian central bank is not doing that, because it's part of the Eurozone, but that's sort of an exception in the world. So the tooth fairy should really stop creating money in the name of the central bank. So we are reclaiming here the authority of the central bank over the generation of additional monetary means and the distribution of monetary means inside an economy. So we finished this part of the song. Let's move on to the second strophe.
There's no such thing as a risk-free asset when you are around. The Wall Street Journal sharply criticize your expansionary policies, but Jeremy claims that you're breaking your mandate. To very, you are fucking anti-constitutional. Did you know that Treasury is a hidden secret index fund to counteract your inflationary pressure? Your plan to destabilize the monetary republic, or that's why with the position inflation is now public domain.
All right, so let's start with the definition of risk-free asset. What is a risk-free asset? Risk-free assets are generally defined as those assets such as treasury bills or real estate investment, maybe in some cases, that have no risk. So you invest your money, you're getting some return, maybe it's not that high, because risk and risk and interest rates are related, and returns are related. Of course, you get more for a more risky project, but you also have higher chances of loss. So for risk-free assets means it's an asset that you are sure you will get your money back. Now, in this case, there's no such thing as a risk-free asset, because if inflation is high, then all the assets, basically all the domestic assets, such as treasury bills, if they are denominated in domestic currency, or even real estate investment projects, they will be losing their value very fast. So when you have these bursts of hyperinflation, such as Venezuela nowadays, such as it was in Yugoslavia in the 90s, and there's plenty of other examples, Germany in the 20s, Hungary in the 50s, I guess, 40s, 50s. When you have these bursts of very high inflation, then everything is uncertain. You don't have risk-free assets anymore. So it's been criticized by the Wall Street Journal. So the Wall Street Journal is, I hope you know that, is one of the most worldwide renewed newspapers on economics and finance. And so it's criticizing the expansionary policies. So expansionary policies is a term that is being used for policies, so monetary policies that induce to an expansion of the monetary base, as the one that is being performed by the Tooth Fairy. Now, Fed Chairman Yellen, as I said at the beginning of the song, this song was written around 2015-16, and at the time, Janet Yellen was the Fed chairman. So Fed is a short term for Federal Reserve, so the central bank of the United States. And she was Fed chairman from 2014 to 2018. She was replaced by Jerome Powell in February 2018, and she replaced Ben Bernanke. Now, as I said, the Federal Reserve is the institution responsible for the issuing of the US currency. And of course, as every central bank, as I mentioned before, for all the central banks, they do not allow other institutions or other people, such as the Tooth Fairy, to interfere with the control of the money supply. And this is what it's saying afterwards. It's breaking your mandate. So the mandate of the Tooth Fairy is surely not generating money out of thin air, and so it shouldn't be. It's basically breaking the law. It's not. It's breaking the contract. It's not. It's doing things that are outside of the legal scope of the Tooth Fairy. So that's why it says it's anti-constitutional. It's basically illegal. What the Tooth Fairy is doing, and so this is what the Fed Chairman Yellen is claiming, and I think Jerome Powell will be claiming the same thing too, if only he knew about the Tooth Fairy. Did you know the Treasury is emitting CPI index bonds to counteract your inflationary pressure? All right, so the Treasury is the Ministry of Finance, and they say it's emitting CPI index bonds. CPI means Consumer Price Index, and Consumer Price Index is a way of measuring inflation. So it's an index that takes into account a given basket of consumer goods, and it's tracking how the prices of these goods are rising or falling, and therefore it's tracking whether inflation is rising or falling. That's the way it's intended. Consumer price inflation, basically. And so one way of counteracting inflation, in the sense of taking it into account and so allowing people to do investments with some degree of safety, is emitting CPI index bonds. So what the Ministry of Finance does basically is selling bonds whose interest rates are indexed to the consumer price index, which means that every year they will take into account into the revaluation also a percentage that's related to this CPI value. And so this is a way of counteracting, of not allowing this kind of assets not to lose too much value during time, also making them good for investors to buy, because if you know that this asset is, this price is going to be re-indexed with the with inflation value, according to the relative inflation value, then it won't lose value during time. You will be offsetting the value being subtracted by the inflation, and so you will be more likely to buy it, and so the treasury will still be able to sell bonds this way. So your plan to destabilize the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela with double-digit inflation is now public domain. So this is another thing that is not strictly true, because we say that it's destabilizing Venezuela with double-digit inflation, which means, so when we wrote the song, the inflation rate in Venezuela was around 60%, so that was the depreciation unofficially, because they had this very weird system where the state was basically fixing the official exchange rate, whereas the black market was determining the real exchange rate of the bolivar, so the national currency of Venezuela, to the dollars, and it was losing value at around 60%, I think, per month back then in 2016. Now this value is much higher. It's 6 digits, and its annualized value is around 500,000. So this is the last value I found. So it's actually much higher than it was. It's 1,000 times higher at least than it was in 2016. It was 1,000 to 10,000 higher. So we are saying that the tooth fairy is causing these inflation rates, these crazy inflation rates in Venezuela. This is not strictly true, because we know that this is due to Maduro printing money like crazy. So anyway, it sounds good. I don't think there's any song ever that had the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela word in it, and it sounds pretty nice in my opinion. This is one of the most hilarious parts of the song, though it's completely serious. Tooth fairy aside, everything else is pretty serious. Now let's go back and listen to one chorus more.
In the name of the Phillips curve, my real trucker surrenders straight, and he'll do everything it takes to shield the USA from your speculative attack.
Alright, so the lyrics of this chorus are the same as the previous one, except for the last line that says, "Stop it in the name of the Phillips curve." So first we are saying stop it in the name of the central bank, now it's stop it in the name of the Phillips curve. So what's the Phillips curve? it's an empirical correlation between unemployment and inflation rates. It's not a strictly causal relation. That's not how Phillips, the guy that sort of discovered it by looking at, I think it was UK data, he sort of found this correlation. So the correlation is between high inflation and low unemployment and vice versa. So there are periods in the history of, he was looking at the UK, but this can be seen in other countries too. You can see for some short times that inflation, so high rates of inflation are related to lower unemployment rates. And and also when you have very tight monetary policy, when you have very low inflation rates, then you see also unemployment increasing. Now, this is not strictly true, and there's counterexamples to this, like for example the US during the 70s, also Italy during the 80s. So there are both countries where you had stagflation, so you had high inflation rates, but this high inflation was also coupled to high unemployment rates at the same time. So this is not strictly true. It's like it's an empirical correlation that happens sometimes. Now, I didn't dig too deep into this, into the evolution of the Phillips curve in neo-Keynesian model and other things. So I'm not aware of the status nowadays. What's the academic status of this of this curve nowadays? How is this regarded? So this is let me tell one more thing. This is not completely negative from the point of view of the tooth fairy, in the sense that high inflation leading to low unemployment, well, this might be a good trade-off, in the sense that low unemployment rates are generally seen as a positive policy feature. So here we come with the beats of the song that refers to Mario Draghi. Actually, Mario Dragons. Dragons is a translation for Italian word Draghi. Is exactly the same, except it sounds more epic in English, I would say. Mario Dragons, I don't know, sort of, it has some sort of Rhapsody of Fire flavor in it. Sounds really nice. And so Mario Dragons already stated he'll do everything it takes to shield Eurozone from your speculative attack. Now, as we listen to in the introduction of the song, in the very first seconds of the song, there's a quote from Mario Draghi. There's an audio excerpt where he says that he's ready to do whatever it takes to protect the euro. This is a famous quote from 2012 during the sovereign debt crisis in Italy and Spain. And he meant to say that the European Central Bank, the ECB, was ready to defend the euro, to stabilize the euro. And what he was actually doing was purchasing bonds, sovereign bonds in the secondary market from Italy and Spain, for example. Also, I think for other troubled countries back then. But Italy and Spain were the main, they were the main targets, so to say, of speculation during 2012. They were the riskier countries. And so has Mario Dragons defeated sort of the speculators, in the sense that after his whatever it take, is this famous quote, the spread, so the difference on the interest rate being paid on periphery sovereign debt, so by periphery I mean Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, with respect to Germany and the core of the Eurozone. So after the whatever it takes, this spread reduced, so the difference in price was reduced thanks to the intervention of Mario Draghi. So thanks to his defense of these peripheral countries. Now here comes the solo. Let's listen to the solo up to the central part, special part of the song. Here we go. All right, so you are committed to high inflation. Okay, first line is pretty much self-evident. Second line, here we go with a quote. We quote Paul Krugman, the famous Nobel Prize economist. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008. He's a former MIT and Princeton professor. He's still nowadays a New York Times columnist. So he was famous for advocating expansionary policies during the Great Recession, so during the last crisis from 2008 to 2012, 13, well, deep into the recovery period. He was still advocating for an increase in the money supply, especially in the EU and especially for Spain, as far as I remember, to get the countries back on track, basically, with public spending and expansion of the monetary supply to restart the economy, to reactivate the economy by stimulating consumption. So, thanks to a higher MPC, as the Tooth Fairy would say. And so, yeah, the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman is on the side of the Tooth Fairy, as they both advocated monetary expansions. There goes the QE1, QE2. QE is an acronym that stands for Quantitative Easing. This is a mechanism by which central banks buy assets such as bonds, shares from financial institutions, from banks, to increase their liquidity. So what happens? Like, if you have a financial institution that cannot lend money because everything is invested in bonds or shares. So the central bank comes and buys these bonds and shares from this financial institution, and this way is allowing the financial institution to get more liquidity, and with this liquidity they can give new loans. With new loans there can be new projects starting, there can be investments in factories. So it's a way of sort of restarting the economy by providing liquidity to banks that have been stuck with a lot of assets in their balance sheets. They cannot be converted, so to say, to liquid money. Or if you had to sell all of them, then, for example, if you were selling all the shares together, then the share price would drop, and this would not be a good thing for the company holding those shares, for example. So this is a way. It's the non-conventional way of intervening in the economy by central banks. This is sort of an emergency mechanism. It was first experimented by the Bank of Japan, then by the US Central Bank, and then also in Europe. It had a different name, but I think it was LTRO, sort of long-term refinancing operation, so something like that. For the BCE under Mario Draghi, that was a mechanism it was using for refinancing, so providing liquidity to banks in the Eurozone. And the same thing happened in the US. It started with the US. So in the US, made the famous acronym QE1, QE2, QE3. That's QE4. There's no such thing as a QE4, but QE1, QE3, and QE1, QE2, and QE3 were three waves of quantitative easings. So three phases that were they were run in 2009, 2010, 2012 also, and they were meant to, again, there were three phases of this buying of assets by the central bank to provide liquidity to private banks and stimulate them, and so in a way to encourage them to borrow, so to lend the money, and so to get more investments going and to get the economy starting. That was more or less the idea. Then let me comment on another couple of terms that are being used here. There is the lender of last resort. So lender of last resort is a name that is usually it's one of the tasks of the central banks. So being a lender of last resort means that when there is a bank run, there is a panic. Everyone is going to withdraw their money from a bank, for example, if there are voices if there are rumors spreading about a bank that is going bankrupt, you don't want to lose your money, you go to the bank and you withdraw all your savings. Except that if everyone does so, then the bank of course does not have all the money altogether. They are probably investing part of that. Maybe the bank is not even that bad. It's just it's just hearsay and rumors that's spread in the world that the bank is insolvent and is going bankrupt. So what the central bank does, it's lending the money to these private banks that can. So this way they don't have to sell all their assets and they can restore confidence in the customers. So again, there's another term here that we encounter is QE3, QE4, increase M1 even more. So M1 is a measure of the money supply. It includes all the most liquid, so it's including money itself, so like coins, banknotes, checks, and everything that can be converted into real money, so to say, in no time. So stocks and bonds, for example, they are not part of M1. You need to sell them, you need to find a buyer, they might not be so liquid. So the Tooth Fairy, by creating new coins, is increasing M1. Now we come to one of the last phrases. Let me comment on this one because I'm pretty proud of this, as it's a very nice and clever analogy. Here it goes. You bail out children by buying their junk teeth at face value. You are the TARP of the human body. So what do you mean? Bail out children? Bailout is a term that has gained popularity in the last years in connection to the bailing out, so to the sort of rescuing of banks and financial institutions when they were in trouble. So they were being rescued by usually by the finance ministry or the central bank or other public institutions. So usually it was something done with public money, whether it was some European institution or national institution, or in the US, whether it was the Federal Reserve or the Treasury. Now, so it's saying that the Tooth Fairy is rescuing the children by buying their junk teeth at face value. So junk is a term that usually applies to unsecured, to very low value financial assets. It's another jargon term for that is widely used in finance. So you'll pretty much often hear the term junk bonds, for example. So here we are saying that Tooth Fairy is buying something of very low value at its face value. So the face value is like its original value. What we're saying is basically you're paying something that it's like second hand and broken for the full price. So it's like the original, the new one, the brand new one. And in this way you are bailing out children. And this comes the metaphor. You are the TARP of the human body. TARP is a program that was started by the late Bush, and it means Troubled Asset Relief Program. It was a program in which the Treasury would buy toxic assets, so junk assets in a way, such as mortgage-backed securities, shares, equity for troubled firms, and so on. And the idea was to give financial relief to institutions that were holding these assets. They were having these bonds, these securities. And so the idea was that the government was buying most of these junk assets, so these shitty securities that might have been also devalued just for a small period of time and whose price later on increased. But anyway, the point is that when the US government bought most of these troubled assets, they were paying them for the face value. So they were not actually taking the market rates for some of them that were completely irrelevant. In some cases, they were close to zero or very, very low. Again, they lost a lot of the value for which they'd been purchased. So again, in a way, we can say that what the Treasury did in this case was to buy used second-hand assets at a new, at the brand new price. So, which was not a very good deal. I mean, in the end, it turned out pretty okay, to be honest. This program did not incur in a very large loss. I mean, it was probably a loss only if accounting for inflation during these years. Otherwise, in monetary terms, it was a plus for the treasury. So the Tooth Fairy is buying junk teeth, so it's buying worthless pieces of the body at their face value, so it's as if they were new. And this is the analogy with the TARP. So the Tooth Fairy is the Troubled Asset Relief Program of the human body. It is a very clever analogy, if I can say clever of something that I've written me myself, but I won't be humble on this. I think it's a very nice analogy, and again, I think it's the only time that the TARP term was featured in one song. Prove me wrong if you can. So let us move on now to the very last sentence of the song. It ends with this different sentence that goes like, "Stop it in the name of the Taylor's rule." Now, first of all, this is not a reference to the Taylor rule of polynomial expansion in calculus. This is a comment that I've seen. There are a couple of comments that think that it was referring to that. No, it's talking about the Taylor rule of John Taylor. So it's it's a rule it's a formula that tells how much should central banks alter interest rates due to changes in economy. So it was like if there is some kind of growth or some kind of unemployment, some given data on unemployment and growth, so what should the interest rate be, and in order to stabilize the economy. So these Taylor's rules tells that Federal Reserve should raise interest rates when inflation is high, or also when employment rate levels are high. These are two of the recommendations of the Taylor's rule. Now, this was the last sentence of the song, and the song is over. And I really appreciate that you listen up to this point. Thanks a lot. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels on YouTube. Follow us and follow me on Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook, and we are on Twitter as well. Don't forget that for the most generous among you, we have a Patreon account, so you're very welcome to join it and donate. We'll be very happy. We need your support to continue our independent music crusade, and now also to support this podcast that is being offered by your host, Gatto Pancheri 666. Thanks a lot to everyone, and see you in the future.